Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're once again with Brother Karim, Leslie Terabesi in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And I'm Dr. Omar Zaid in Liberty, Kentucky, USA. And we're going to continue our conversation that has to do with the revisionism, the Quranist revisionism of the thing we call Islam, which is actually Al Islam, according to instructor Bilal, whom I'm also working with, fortunate enough and blessed to work with both these gentlemen. So let's proceed. We were touching on elements that had to do with the murder of the philosophers and the participation or events or situations and circumstances that coincided as having to do with the Fatimid dynasty, which we really just introduced. We didn't penetrate it at all. But before we do that, dear brother, I'm going to sort of flank you here, if you will, with
Go
with
ahead.
something out of the blue, but it's something out of the past here because the connection that I have and I'm going to make here between that time and what's happening in the world now, especially with the establishment of the New World Order. At both extremes here, we still have an element of Jews who are not Jews involved um, in the activities that are running counter to Al Islam, counter to what the Christians call Christianity, counter to anything that anyone of reason would consider godly. Okay, so we're now living in an ungodly society at the time that the philosophers were murdered by the Muslim leaders who were predominantly Sunni at the time. Um, they were also pretending to be God's representatives. And today we have people pretending to be something better than God, you see. And if we take the Nietzschean position, well, God died last century, and we've taken over. You see, we've become the Ubermensch, and we know better. And although Nietzsche was not a Jew, at the helm of all of these movements, these revolutionary movements, these movements that go counter to anything that is godly, we have Jews who are not Jews. And what I mean by when I say that is we have people who think they're Jewish or don't even attend to the religion, but have a cultural or even a genetic um, history that lends them to what they call Judaism, but it's not the Judaism of Bani Israel. It's not the Judaism of the Bible, although there are elements there that they adapt and adopt. But what we have is a group of people who have taken over the helm of political leadership, which means the wielding power. And at the helm of what's taken place just prior to and after the events of 9/11 is what we have something called the neoconservative movement. And here again, we have a bunch of Jews at the helm, and they're not necessarily religious Jews, but they have this sort of, if you want to call it, Eastern European, pseudo Khazarian uh, relationship to jewelry, the same kind of jewelry that led to the communist revolution and the millions of murders there, and also in China. And oh, well, dare I bring up China? Of course, because Mao was under the tutelage of Jews. And he killed more people in his country than Stalin and the others did in Russia, and they were Jews. Stalin was a Jew. His name means of or from the Jews. So if you get into that, so what I'm trying to get here is there's something you said last month or maybe the previous month. I've forgotten how long we've been doing this now. In any case, you mentioned something about Leo Strauss. Now, Leo Strauss is considered to be the father of the neoconservative movement, and these neocons are the ones who used his noble lie of 9/11 to justify the invasions and of the Muslim world, and launched this new crusade, because that's what it is. Even Bush used the word crusade. He said this crusade's going to take quite a while, if I paraphrase and quote him in one of his speeches, as as we enter the new world order. Now, you said that you came across the teachings of Leo Strauss, and that his teachings were misconstrued or misunderstood. And I'd like you to expound on that a little bit, if you would, brother, so that we can put the modern context in its proper perspective before we look back another 1,000 years and see, well, is there any correlation to between what's happening now and what happened 1,000 years ago with respect to these Jews who are not Jews? And why I bring that up is because if before we enter the Fatimid, we have to discuss this fellow Abdallah ibn Maimun, who was a Jewish mystic out of the Persian schools. So, and he gave birth to what we would call the Fatimid dynasty, and that whole fallacy, which took over the western wing of Islam for the next 200 years before Salahuddin kicked them out, so to speak. So, what is it that you admired about this man, Professor Leo Strauss, dear brother? Please enlighten us.
Yes. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Yes, thank you for the question. And yeah, you touched on a question that I could go on talking about a long time, brother, because how do I put this? Where do I begin? I guess the
Yes.
beginning, the right place. As you recall, when I was admitted into the university at the University of Guelph in Ontario, that was in 1972. I had this very something of a strange experience. I walked into the bookstore. Of course, I was all excited about being at the university. You know, of course, the universities in Canada are in very good shape. They are well funded by the government. They are of a quite high standard. So I felt very, very enthusiastic, you know. But the strange experience was that I began to look at the books that they had there. And I picked up one after the other, and I read a paragraph here and there, or maybe a few sentences here and there, and I realized that none of those books held my interest. Wherever I opened the book, no matter what page, no matter what book it was, the material seemed to me irrelevant, uninteresting, and so it came to the point where I was beginning to wonder, what am I doing here? I cannot find a single book that holds my interest here. And then I picked up a copy of Leo Strauss's Natural Right and History. And shortly after that, I also picked up a copy of C.B. Macpherson's Theories of Possessive Individualism. C.B. Macpherson was a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Toronto's political science faculty. And in fact, I audited one of his courses. And in fact, interestingly, Leo Strauss refers positively to C.B. Macpherson's work. But what was it in these two books that, what did they have in common? Because ideologically they were quite apart, you see. Strauss was writing from what could be called, as you mentioned, a conservative perspective, right? I sense that there some kind of an effort to rescue, if you like, traditional values, you see, of the
Hmm.
Western civilization,
Hmm.
specifically the belief in truth, although he doesn't use the expression objective truth, but what he called actually natural right. What he meant by
Hmm.
that was the justice, basically. Justice is what is right by nature, you see. And
Hmm.
in Western civilization, the justice or what is right has been basically presented as some kind of a historical experience. In other words, justice is presented to us, or natural right, as something that changes with the passage of history. In other words, that justice somehow is not constant. But
Uh-huh.
anyway, now to come back to what captivated me and what the two books had in common, I would say you could sum it up in a single word: clarity.
Hmm.
Clarity of style. The
Hmm.
style in both cases was very clear, very sharp, very focused,
Hmm.
very precise,
Hmm.
very economical. You had a sense that every word in every sentence was exactly where it was supposed to be. A highly
Hmm.
disciplined, focused form of writing. So that's basically what got me interested in it. And also, in fact, I began to develop a deeper interest because I personally also sensed something wrong with our civilization. As you
Hmm.
know, it's only been 4 years since I migrated from Czechoslovakia in 1968 to Canada,
Hmm.
after having lived, been born and raised under communism, where the religion is basically the communist ideology, you might say.
Hmm.
And of course, I knew, I was aware of the problems faced by communism. Yeah,
Hmm.
we backward. Our supermarkets were like almost empty. The
Yes.
general poverty. We were all equal, yes, but equally poor. Basically, we couldn't
Hmm.
afford to go abroad for a vacation. Yes,
Hmm.
we had food on the table, and nobody was without a job. But it was It was an existence. It wasn't really life.
Hmm.
So, of course, when I migrated to Canada, I saw all this wealth of the capitalist system. The first supermarket I went into in Toronto it was about 20 times bigger than the biggest I've seen back in Czechoslovakia. And the
Hmm.
great volume and variety of goods was just astonishing. And he had these big cars, and Canadians were very confident in the way they carried about, very self assured, while we were generally speaking kind of, maybe I can use the word wimpy, by comparison. It's been hammered into us that we should not try to be better than other people, you see. So
Yes.
you blend in with the group. So it was group think, you might say.
Yes.
While of course the West places a significant degree of emphasis on individualism, being
Yes.
your own man, so to speak. And of
Hmm.
course that is also a trait in your own culture or American culture. But I think you're originally from Australia, or am I wrong, bruh?
No,
From
no, I'm from America.
Oh, all right. So then you probably know very well better than I what I'm talking about. So now I sensed, however, that even in Canada there was something missing. You see, and what
Hmm.
was missing there, what troubled me was people always telling me things like whenever I expressed an opinion about anything having to do with ethics or morality, they would say things like, "Oh, that's just your subjective opinion." In other words, everything was
Yes.
there was no objective truth, none at all.
I
So
see.
I was wondering, well, how can this
That
be?
disturbed you.
Yes, and it still
Hmm.
does actually,
Hmm.
because even in Islam, we get people who are telling us that the Quran can be interpreted in so many different ways, and that there's really no way of coming to a consensus or ijma on a correct, as it were, interpretation of a
Hmm.
particular verse.
Hmm.
So to me, this moral relativism, as Leo Strauss called it, and as his favorite student, Alan Bloom, who was also my teacher, called it, moral relativism is a huge problem in Western civilization because
Hmm.
basically it implies that there are no transhistorical values, there are no transhistorical eternal principles. Everything is subject to change, and we basically are not in a position to know the truth with a capital T. We only have the little truths, just like
Hmm.
Nietzsche. He did. It seems he didn't believe in God as the truth with a capital T, but he certainly had no trouble believing in the many little truths,
Hmm.
little gods that he, in fact, I think, in some way, even encouraged people to create for themselves. You see,
Yes,
as
yes,
he
yes.
did.
Hmm.
So this moral relativism was really, troubling me, and I remember
Hmm.
thinking a few times because the life at the university campus was very free. It was like almost anything goes, you see.
Yes, yes.
And I remember walking into the, student residence, and people there in the corner at the table were handing out free condoms to people, And so I was thinking, well, this is what they call the permissive society, you see.
Yes.
It seemed to me,
Hmm.
encouraging, now what word do I use here? I don't want to be accused of being a redneck or a square or whatever the terms are normally used, but seemed to me like it was encouraging promiscuous activity, but maybe
Hmm.
the word promiscuous is too strong. So I said to myself, there have to be some rules.
Yes.
Life is not possible without the rules. There
Hmm.
has to be a difference between right and wrong, you see.
Hmm.
And this is what attracted me to Strauss's writing, because he affirmed, perhaps he didn't use that language, but he affirmed very, I think powerfully in different ways, that there is a difference between right and wrong. We just
Hmm.
need to discover what it is. There
Hmm.
is such a thing as something what is right by nature, you see. So now he
Hmm.
appealed to nature, following the Greeks. The Greek term for nature is physis,
Hmm.
from which the word physics comes from. So he appealed to the term nature. For some reason, he felt he did not want to appeal to religion. I mean, he was active in America in the latter part of his life. And if you were to tell the average, even educated American, that this is right because God says so, I mean, not many people would agree with you. They
Hmm. Yes,
probably
yes.
hear that's very nice, brother, but that's just your subjective opinion, you see.
Hmm.
So he didn't make an appeal to religion, the teaching of religion, and in fact, one of his students pointed out that the word nature does not occur in the Old Testament at all, or in the Bible
Hmm.
more generally. So, but this was, and I think this is why, when he affirmed that there's a difference between right and wrong, and this difference can be objectively known, he attracted two types of responses. One, first people jumped on him and said, "Oh, here we have an authoritarian." Okay,
Hmm.
like this, he had a few detractors,
Yes.
including there was a BBC production, "The Power of Nightmares," where he
Hmm.
was compared to Said Qutb, you see, as an authoritarian.
Hmm.
But I don't believe that he was an authoritarian. I think he was actually a serious scholar. I believe so. And he
Hmm.
would not have approved of the excesses or problems or the actions of some of his students because, as we know, Paul Wolfowitz took a few of his classes.
Hmm.
But then we have to remember that we cannot blame the teacher for the transgressions of their students.
This is why I
Socrates
asked
was
the question. And this is why
exactly.
I asked the question. Yes.
Socrates was in a very similar position because during his
Hmm.
trial, he was accused of having taught Alcibiades, who was a prominent Athenian youth,
Hmm.
who betrayed his own city state, Athens, and went over to the enemy, Sparta,
Hmm.
had an affair with the wife of the Spartan king over there, and schemed to bring about the downfall of his own homeland, which is to
Yes.
say, Athens. And he was blamed for that. And so people
Hmm.
were pointing out, well, I have no control over what my students do. Please give me a,
Mm-hmm.
break. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, Muhammad Abdul Wahab, the author of the book on Tawheed, from whom the term Wahhabis comes from, I read his
Mm-hmm.
book on Tawheed, and quite frankly, I can openly say that I did not find anything objectionable in that book. I read it in translation, yes, but
Mm-hmm.
I found nothing at all objectionable in that book. The
Mm-hmm.
book basically emphasizes two things. It emphasizes the oneness of Allah, and it criticizes or cautions us against polytheism or shirk. That is the basic thrust of the book. You see,
Mm-hmm.
to me, is completely consistent with the teaching of the Quran. Now, I raised this issue with a friend, a colleague of mine from the university, the Islamic Science University of Malaysia, who was this gentleman is from Libya. So I asked him about this, and he said, "Yeah, Abdul Wahab was in himself. It was his followers who committed these excesses, these murders, and these slaughters.
Mm-hmm.
He
Mm-hmm.
didn't do it, and he didn't advise it either." And in fact, I
Mm-hmm.
read someplace that, according to one commentator, that actually Strauss himself condemned preemptive war. He would not
Mm-hmm.
have agreed with these attacks on the foreign nations
Mm-hmm.
in the manner in which was carried out by
Mm-hmm.
the U.S. administration. And not only that, I can mention one very interesting comment that came from a Muslim scholar, my friend, and I think the brother of a person that you admire, Professor Said Naqib Alatas.
Yes.
I had the privilege to know his older brother, whose
Mm-hmm.
name may bless his soul. He was Professor Dr. Said Hussein Alatas.
Mm-hmm.
I used to visit him once a week, every Thursday, and we talked from about 10 p.m. until about 3:30 a.m. This went on for about a year. And in one of our discussions, he informed me that when he was in Holland doing his PhD thesis,
Mm-hmm.
he came across Strauss's work and he read all his books. And what he told me after reading all his books? He said to me that if someone were to tell him, to Professor Alatas, that Strauss was a Muslim, he would
Mm-hmm.
have believed it. He would have believed it. Why?
Yeah.
Because he wrote like a Muslim.
I
So now,
see.
yeah, exactly. So now, I would say if you want to get an assessment of Strauss's work, just read some of his work. You see,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
there are many. The one that I referred to, Natural Right and History. His favorite student, Alan Bloom, told me personally one time
Mm-hmm.
when we had a discussion in his office that he somehow hinted that that was not his best book, because
Mm-hmm.
I think he hinted that maybe the approach was somewhat, he used the word passion versus reason, and yes, Strauss does use that opposition in Natural Right and History, that we can be motivated by passion, or we can be sort of guided or restrained by reason. Yes, it is there. My feeling was that Bloom was hinting that maybe this was a little too maybe it required a more comprehensive, or analytical framework. In other words, that the expression was perhaps oversimplifying matters a little bit. But
Mm-hmm.
Bloom himself also mentioned that among his best books is the Thoughts on Machiavelli, which, by the way, begins with a sentence which condemns Machiavelli as a teacher of evil. You see,
Mm-hmm.
I don't. I am aware that Strauss, wrote about, the so-called noble light, which we find explained in a
Mm-hmm.
republic. It was a republic, but I don't think it follows from that he would have approved, you see, the noble lie in the form of what happened on 9/11. You see,
Mm-hmm.
because I don't know what is your view, but my perception of the events of 9/11 is that this was, as many people in America, in fact, believe, I'm not sure what is the percentage, but it's quite substantial, 30% or more, and globally as well. Most people don't buy the official narrative of the events that transpired on that day.
It's
And
a lie.
so, yeah, of course.
The official
But it's,
narrative is a bold lie. That's what it is.
yes, but the lie is
Hmm.
not a noble lie, you see.
Of course, it's not. It's ignoble, if anything. Mm.
Yeah, I think now about the noble lie, founded public, what was he referring to? perhaps certain public myths or opinions that are necessary to maintain the cohesiveness of society. I don't know. I don't want to skate on thin ice here. Perhaps that's still a work in progress, even for me. But
Well,
uh,
it's kind of, if you, I'm going to oversimplify here. Let's just say, okay, grandma walks into the house and she's pushing 60 years old and she's trying to hold on to her beauty, and she says, "How do I look?" And you say, "Oh, fabulous." Okay. Well, there's no sense in upsetting her cart. Why would you do that? It doesn't make any sense. Because that would affect everybody for the entire day. It would put grandma in a bad mood. So you look wonderful. You don't have to say you look wonderful for your age, grandma. I mean, if you want to, you can add that little phrase, but there's no need to do it. So the white lie is okay. I don't see anything wrong with that as long as you're actually serving peace. You see, and that's the
yeah,
key. That's the key word here. Their lie was not serving peace, it was serving the aggrandizement of the empire of the hidden hand, as I like to call it. So um, I don't see anything wrong with that. So if Mr. Strauss was pushing that aspect of it. And from what I know of Machiavelli, he was not necessarily an evil fellow. He was just trying to teach the prince under his tutelage how best to hold on to his power. Now, let's just suppose that, okay, this power is power. Uh, it is, if you look at it from the perspective of natural force, it's indiscriminate. You see. If you look at power in the hands of a human being, then it becomes discriminate. And once you become discriminate, you have to have the power of discernment. And the power of discernment depends on, well, how you were indoctrinated. Are you going to be selfish with that, with the wielding of the power, or are you going to be generous with the wielding of that power? Who are you going to protect? Whose interest are you going to protect? And Machiavelli was protecting the interests of the prince, seeing that the prince, assuming that the prince had the best interest of his subjects at heart. So, what are we talking about here? We're talking about the difference between good and evil, okay? Because there are evil people in the earth and they do organize their evil, and you do have to withstand them if you're going to be a prince and hold on to that power, because these evil people, that's what they want. That's what they want. I mean, Shakespeare made it very clear in his plays, and it's been this great play throughout history. So, if we're looking at something constant, I'm hoping that you're suggesting here that Mr. Strauss was laying this power struggle out, perhaps without referring to deity, but nevertheless, it's there. You see, and if you put it in those terms, there's nothing evil about telling grandma she looks fabulous. Okay, so we can accept that noble lie and get on with the rest of the day and enjoy our lunch and our dinner too, especially if she's cooking, right? So, there's nothing wrong with that. So I'm assuming, before you say another word, that Mr. Strauss was doing this, you know, nothing more than that. And he was doing it with the greatest of clarity that someone like Professor Alatas would appreciate, you see. And if he's got the imprimatur from Professor Alatas, dear friend, dear brother Karim, I am all ears. And I'm so glad that I brought this question up to you today. So please proceed.
yeah. I need to correct myself. I think I
Mhm.
suggested just now that Alan Bloom suggested that Strauss's best book was the book on Machiavelli. I think I think he suggested it was one of his best books, or but I think
Mhm.
the book that I recall now, he mentioned it by name, and it is a book called The City and Man.
Uh-huh.
And the book consists basically of an introduction and three essays, one on Plato's Republic, one on, I believe, Aristotle's Politics, and one on Thucydides' Peloponnesian War.
Mm-hmm.
But there is, and in the introduction, of course, Strauss talks about the threat to the Western civilization arising from moral relativism. But the concluding sentence in that introduction is very interesting because he says the following, and I'm repeating his words to the best of my recollection. He says that um, there's one question that the philosophers never state openly or publicly, but they are always thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And this question is, and then he switches to Latin, and he says three words.
Mm-hmm.
And the three words are quid sit Deus. Now,
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
Latin, that means what is God? You see,
Mm-hmm.
what is God? So, according to Strauss, this is the question that weighs most heavily on the minds of the philosophers,
Mm-hmm.
but for some reason they are reluctant to admit they are thinking about God.
Mm-hmm.
So, maybe they are not that far apart from theologians.
Yes.
And don't forget, Strauss, actually, according to a friend of mine, he claims that actually Strauss knew Arabic. I need to
Mm-hmm.
confirm this, but he was certainly very interested in the work of Al-Farabi, and he spoke with a great deal of
Mm-hmm.
respect of Al-Farabi, who introduced, I think, Aristotle to the Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
I think his commentaries on Aristotle were translated into Latin by an English translator. His name is William of Moerbeke. And according to Bloom, these translations from Greek to Latin were so outstanding that they enabled, this is also almost verbatim, that they enabled Thomas Aquinas to become an expert in Aristotle without
Mm-hmm.
knowing Greek.
Oh gosh,
Yes, this is amazing.
that's
So,
that's remarkable. Yeah.
yeah, very remarkable because he was made this comment in reference to his own translation of the
Mm-hmm.
Republic from English, which I think is outstanding, and many people agree with that. And he said that when he translated his Plato's Republic into English, he was aiming to achieve what William of Moerbeke, sought. He said something to the effect, "My goal," and then he puts a dash, and then he writes the word "unattained." Another dash was to come up with as good a translation as William of Moerbeke's translations of Al-Farabi's commentaries on Aristotle
Mm-hmm.
from, sorry, how was that? Now I'm getting confused here. As the translations of William of Moerbeke of Aristotle from Greek into Latin. That is what he
Mm-hmm.
was aiming for. But Strauss was also interested in Maimonides, who was a Jewish scholar
Mm-hmm.
who also read, I believe, about Aristotle in Arabic. And this Maimonides apparently was in some ways a precursor of Spinoza, who later on went on to write his theological political treatise, which was laid the foundation for the European Enlightenment. Hegel had high praise for the book because it was the first sort of focused, rational examination of the Old Testament that we have in
Mm-hmm.
so-called Enlightenment, European Enlightenment. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, Hegel continued, and so did Rousseau before him in some ways, in his
Mm-hmm.
writing religion in the Emile, which got him into trouble because the Catholic authorities, there was a mob that came and stoned Rousseau's house after this book was published. But anyway, Hegel followed
Mm-hmm.
in his line as well, because he himself attempted to subject the New Testament, in this case, to a rational inquiry in a book called The Positivity of the Christian Religion, which can be found online in translation, in a book called Hegel's Early Theological Writings. And in that book, Hegel himself, by the way, wanted to be the professor emeritus of philosophy at the University of Toronto, whose class I, on the Hegel's Berlin Lectures on the Philosophy of Religion, I took that class. I wrote a paper there for him, and I got a good grade. Well, I managed an A in the course, but anyway. He mentioned that Hegel, as a young man, he wanted to be what we would call today an Ustad, a religious teacher. The German
Hmm.
expression is Volkserzieher, the teacher of
Hmm.
people. So
Hmm.
he wrote this tract, The Positivity of the Christian Religion, in attempting to separate the original teaching of Isa alayhi salam from the positive elements of Christianity, which, according to Hegel, were added on afterwards, you see.
Hmm.
So he also attempted this critique of the New Testament in this case, as Spinoza did. As Spinoza did a critique from a rational perspective of the Old Testament. By the way, Spinoza's work got him into trouble with the Jewish community, which were offended. They were offended by his work and they excommunicated him. I don't know what is
Hmm.
the Jewish term for excommunicating people. I think that's a Catholic term, something
Yeah.
similar.
Well,
Yes,
I understand. I understand that he was forced to go through some sort of exilic initiation, right? He had to lay at the threshold of the door to the synagogue, and everyone in the congregation stepped on him as they left. So,
oh,
and then he
really?
was
Never heard.
yeah, and he was never allowed to enter the synagogue again after that. This was
That's
really quite something. I don't know if this is true, but I read that in Will Durant's history,
oh, that's
when his history of philosophy, which is quite a nice little book, by the way.
yeah,
For
it's
the
quite well.
for those of you who don't want to spend hours and hours and days and years on philosophy, get Will Durant's book on the history of philosophy. It launched his career, and it's very succinct. It explains things in a very down to earth fashion. And what you're describing here, uh, Brother Karim, is the fact that philosophy and theology are married. They're joined at the hip, and I think what we're talking about here, especially with regards to the mass murder of the philosophers, is a forced divorce. You see. And the philosopher and the theologian don't really want to divorce each other, you see, because they can't. If they're joined at the hip by the natural course of fitra, which is placed in our heart to begin with, then this divisiveness has to have a solution, you see. And I think if we look at the Quran, and we look at someone like Leo Strauss with the eyes of Professor Alatas, we begin to find that solution. So I'm going to repeat myself here. I'm so very glad that I asked you this question. Let's get back to Mr. Strauss and how he was misunderstood, or maybe he wasn't misunderstood, and his students just decided to use these principles, you see, in a application of negative force, or shall we say positive force, for their goals rather than the betterment of humanity. And if you can use the apology here. Oh, we're going to do this for the good of all, for the better good. Is that right? Well, that's an old ancient lie as well. How did someone like Strauss handle these contradictions?
Well, first of all, let me mention that Strauss actually did not accuse Machiavelli of being evil. What he said was that
Good.
Machiavelli was a teacher of evil. Now, I'm not
Hmm.
sure whether you can be a teacher of evil without the person being evil himself.
Hmm.
What do you think? Can a person teach evil without being evil himself?
Well, this is what Harut and Marut did. You see, it's an exposition of what can be done. Sometimes, it depends on what the motivation is. It depends on what the intention is, isn't it? I mean, if you're going to take it upon yourself to act preemptively, then you have to be able to identify the enemy. You see, let's go back to Lao Tzu. You have to identify the enemy, and if you want to defeat that enemy, you want to make a preemptive strike. And you don't do this militarily, you do this with propaganda, and you destroy the enemy from within. And that's how you win the war. The person who's won the war has done it without lifting the sword. according to the art of war. So if this is what you're doing and you're going to preserve peace while defeating your enemy and bring him down for the betterment of all, that's not evil. That's using what otherwise would be evil, you see, for the purpose of for selfish means, for selfish intents, for self-aggrandizement. But if you're the prince who's protecting the good of your people, and if someone's headed their way with a sword raised, you have to take that person down before he gets to your people. Those people under your arm, under your right arm, you see. So this is not evil. Now you can call it evil if you want, but it's the same mechanism. And as I read Machiavelli, and I haven't read him for quite some time now, but as I read him, this is what he was doing. He said, look, you're surrounded by all these evil SOBs, and this is how you're going to have to deal with them. Okay.
Right.
Now, that's how I see it. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, I recall a quotation that Strauss used from The Prince, I believe, where Machiavelli says that one quotation says that a prince has to know how not to be. He needs sometimes he needs to know how not to be good, and
Yes.
because he says that in Italian it says la bontà non basta, and that means goodness is not enough. And then he also refers to, as Strauss points out, this sentence in The Prince. Machiavelli refers to, I quote, this is a quotation, Hannibal's inhuman cruelty.
Mhm.
And then he has the following words, and other virtues. Yeah.
Yes.
So Machiavelli refers to
Yes. Yes.
Hannibal's inhuman cruelty and other virtues. So
Well,
now,
Peterson made the same. It took the same position recently as this year. He said the greatest men on the earth are the ones you have to fear. They're the best men. You better fear them because you don't
no,
want to get on their wrong side. If you get on their wrong side, that means that you're offending the right hand of God. In so many words, you see. If you're going to offend the right hand of God, and then you're being a bit like Genghis Khan and his sons when they destroyed Baghdad. Kublai Khan rode in to the mosque there in Baghdad. He said, "Had you not sinned against God, He would not have sent me." You see. So, and the atrocities that he committed were awful. Now, did God sanction these? I'm not going to go that far to say yes or no. But what God did sanction was that hand, that heavy hand, which he called the hammer of God. He said, I am the hammer of God. And I don't think anybody's challenged that since that day. And when I bring this up in discussions with the Ummah, no one wants to discuss this in a thorough going fashion, you see, because it's too awful to contemplate. So Jordan Peterson made this same, took the same position recently. He said the best men on the earth are the ones that were to be feared the most. So if you want to, it's okay if you're going to fear the enemy and be helpless before the enemy. That's all fine. So we want the hero. We really do want Superman. We need Superman. But these are not supermen. These are men who take a strong position. They're like the Sioux warrior who plants his staff in the ground and says, "Here I stand. Don't cross that line because it's you or I. You know, today's a good day to die. Are you ready, sir? Are you ready, madam? Okay. If you're not prepared to take that position, don't don't pretend that you are going to be talking for God. So I think this position is misunderstood, and we got this sort of turn the other cheek Christian, you know, narrative here, and that's misunderstood as well. Because if you want to get to the words of Jesus, the words of Isa, he also said, "Well, turn your other cheek if your brother offends you. If he strikes you, turn the other cheek." Well, he said, "If your brother, okay, well." The one who is your enemy is not your brother. If he's the enemy of God, then he's your enemy. He's not your brother because he also defined who your brother is. He said, "He who does the will of my Father in heaven, or my generator, my originator, my creator in heaven, he is my brother. She is my mother. She is my sister." You see, it's like that. So if you're going to be the right hand of God, you're going to speak for the right hand of God, you have to take this church militant position as the Catholics pretended to do. You see, and then they just indiscriminately slaughter anyone who doesn't kiss the Pope's ring. Or is that discriminate slaughter? You see, well, sometimes you kill the innocent along the way, and that's collateral damage, right? Oh well, Billy Crystal, or whatever his name is, Crystal, and your teacher, they apologized for that, didn't they? We have collateral damage; it's permitted, right? So we can just press this button and kill 50 people with a bomb sent from a drone, while we're comfortably eating pizza and drinking beer in our little shed on the other side of the earth. We can kill 50 innocent people in order to kill one guilty leader. Well, how do we know he's guilty? Oh, the CIA told us. Is that right? Oh, gosh. Well, here we go again. Shall we go in this circle? I don't think so. We're trying to bypass this circle of evil because that's really evil. When you stop using this intelligently for the right reasons, for the truly greater good, then you are on this circle of evil, and it's a broken record over and over and over again. And people want to know, well, why aren't we making any real progress? Well, it's because you're stupid. You're making the same mistakes over and over and over again, and you're believing the lie. And that brings us back to this noble lie, doesn't it? So, again, brother, I ask you the same question. Why was this Mr. Strauss misunderstood? Or was he?
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't think he was misunderstood by everyone. There are many people, I think, who understood him, and there are two camps basically, as the supporters and detractors. But I'd just like to comment briefly on Jordan Peterson's words.
Yes.
I haven't actually seen the video where he allegedly says that the greatest men are those who are the feared most. But if he really said that, I think I have issues with that statement. First of all, the word
Well, I
great,
paraphrased it. I may have misspoken. So,
true,
but
but
the idea is there.
yeah, because I think the word great should not be applied to men. Allah is great. So to
Okay.
use a word like great to apply to people is to turn, there's a danger of turning people into gods. Now, I would say, who are the best men or
All
the
right.
best
Maybe the
people?
best man. Yeah. Huh.
I would say they are not the people who are feared. They are the people who fear someone who is truly great. And that someone who is truly great is none other than Allah Himself. So I'm
Yes, I
sorry,
agree with you
I
there.
have to report that if Jordan Peterson said that, then he's dead wrong. He really messed up with that remark if he really said that. But let's give him the benefit of doubt.
Well, I don't think he was speaking in a deist position there. He was speaking in terms of pure humanism, and is speaking in terms of the human factor without the godly factor. Although the godly factor is there always. So if you're going to be the best man, you see, then you also have to be feared more than your enemy, who is feared. Okay, is what his position is. In other words, strength calls for strength, power calls for power. If you don't assume that power, then that power is going to be assumed by the enemy of the greater good. And they're going to use the lie that they are defending the greater good, which is what the neocons have done, you see. So I may have misspoke and may have misrepresented Mr. Peterson. I don't want to do that at all. What I'm trying to say is, and what I think Mr. Peterson was trying to say is that, hey, the kind of guy that you want to align yourself with is also the kind of guy that you're going to be afraid of or at least your enemy is going to be afraid of. You see, yeah, you should say, okay, well, the best king is one who's loved. Well, yeah, I think the best king is one who's both loved and feared. You see, we love God. We also fear His wrath, and there are those who say, well, God doesn't get angry, but God does become decisive. You see, and there are consequences. You see, so who's going to be in control of the consequences? We'd rather have someone who's godly and strong in control of those bringing about those consequences, rather than someone who's ungodly and strong. Is what Jordan Peterson says, and he said that's the better man. And I think that Nietzsche was going in that direction too, but without any reference to God at all, saying that we can do it all on our own. You see.
Well, apparently Nietzsche said that his idea of the overman was someone who had the heart of Jesus and the power of Caesar. So
Yes.
that is an interesting combination.
Yes.
But back to Jordan's Peterson's comment, you see the word fear. I think fear is a form of worship. When Jordan Peterson, if he's asking us to fear men, he's effectively asking us to worship men, and he's calling us to shirk or polytheism. That's terribly
Mm.
wrong, I would
Mm.
say.
Well, I don't think. Again, I may have misspoke by using the word fear, but it was something going in that direction. You see, you're being a purist here with your definition, and I appreciate that. And that's absolutely correct. In an absolute sense, that purest definition, who's to be feared? Yeah, okay. Well, we fear only Allah, and that's the way to stand on the earth. But we also fear a panther in the jungle when we cross its path. You see, so in that lesser connotation is what I'm talking about. We will fear the presence of an evil man. Okay, and any soldier who's worth his salt will tell you that they fear the enemy before they go into battle. You see, so this fear is, in that sense, is not a thing of reverence or a thing of worship, but in the ultimate sense of this fear, you see, we want to fear the wrath of God, or the loss of God's grace is probably better said.
You see, to me, the point of piety or taqwa, a
Mm,
person, when you learn to fear Allah, you lose the fear of anything else, including men. And if you
mm,
still retain some fear of men after becoming a Muslim, fearing Allah, then your faith still needs to be, like you said, purified. You still have a way to go. A true
hmm.
Muslim is only fears Allah and nothing but Allah. The moment you fear anything else, I think there's some that this person has some homework to do. But correct me if I'm missing something.
No, no, you're absolutely correct there. That's absolutism. All right. There's no I have no argue with you at that, but there are very few people who get to that point in their life. Very few. There are some. I've met a few, only a handful,
Yeah.
okay, who can actually express that as a living reality. But most
Yeah.
of the people whom I've come in contact with, for example, in the academic world, they fear their immediate superiors. They fear crossing them. And so, because they fear that, they won't speak the truth, or they won't even write it, you see. So, this is the sort of thing that I'm talking about. The fearless man that Jordan Peterson is talking about here, the one that you should respect, maybe is the better word, okay, um, is the one who is fearless, who you've just described, because he fears Allah, okay.
Allah
But
alone.
yes, Allah alone. But like the warrior who is met on the battle, the one whom they fear is the one who's fearless, you see. And what Jordan Peterson said is, you don't want to get on that guy's wrong side, because he's fearless and he will take you down.
Well, like I said, I watched a few of his videos, and most of the time he seems to talk sense. Actually, he reminds me a lot of, he reminds me to some extent of Alan Bloom, because Bloom was also a sort of, there are these traditional perceptions, and
Hmm.
even some other Straussians like Harvey Mansfield, I think, of Harvard University, either wrote a paper or gave a talk, maybe both, on manliness, you see.
Yes.
That the men are no longer real men, as it were, and something happened. And I read in the literature, I forget exactly who wrote this, but one of the Straussians observed that, the meaning of the word virtue changed in the Western civilization, because
Hmm.
for the ancient Greeks, the classical civilization, the word virtue, the Greek word is arete, meant to the mainstream society, it meant the manliness of a man. But
Hmm.
in later Romantic Europe, in the period of Romanticism, which is quite different from the classical period, the meaning of the word virtues, suddenly the word virtue began to mean the chastity of a woman, you see.
Hmm.
So there's a virtuous woman, you see. So
Hmm.
abstaining from sexual activity with anyone other than her husband, that is considered virtue. But in the classical period, virtue was something that was applied to men. So there was a shift from man to woman, as it were,
Hmm.
in this transition from the classical period to the romantic period. But to
Yes.
come back to your earlier question, is why did people not perhaps become hostile? Maybe if I can rephrase the question that way
Hmm.
to start. You see, because they sensed a certain elitism in his
Hmm.
writing. He, for instance, endorsed the idea. I think it was originally the idea of Mortimer Adler, who wrote extensively about education. And he was something of an Aristotelian, and he argued in favor of the so-called great books program, that
Hmm.
the university should only focus on the best books available in the world. So these were the top 100 books, and this is what was called the so-called Great Books Program.
Yes, I
So
remember that. Yeah.
in other words, we should not waste our time on anything second rate. And
Hmm.
I fundamentally don't disagree with that. I'm sure
Hmm.
the Quran would be among those 100 books. So that's one reason. Another reason why Strauss aroused the ire of many people is because he was perceived to be anti-feminist, you see.
Hmm.
Uh, he wrote a paper that was circulated privately. I'm not sure if it was ever published, but it was called The Three Waves of Modernity. And one of the waves of modernity was feminism. And he was basically saying how feminism was destroying the family. And this
Hmm.
was not right. The
Yes.
family should not be destroyed by,
Hmm.
radical feminism and what have you. Another
Hmm.
reason why people, I think, had issues with his writing is because how do I put it? He was accused of being, I said already, elitist, anti-feminism, and
Hmm.
something to do with, he. Now this is a sensitive issue,
Hmm.
is academic standards. You see, he how the peace movement also had some issues with him
Hmm.
because even though he did not, I think, he would not support a preventive war, or what Muslim scholars, the majority of them actually did support. It's called Jihad al-Talab. And I've just
Hmm.
published a book on that earlier
Hmm.
today, now being reviewed by Amazon. We need to rethink this doctrine of Jihad al-Talab, or aggressive or preemptive war, which basically calls
Hmm.
for spreading Islam by the sword. And
Hmm.
this was a position taken up by the majority of the Muslim ulama, including people like Al-Mawardi, then Imam al-Ghazali, Imam al-Shafi, and even the fellow that wrote Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun. According
Hmm.
to Ibn Rushd, the majority of the Muslim ulama endorsed preemptive war. Yeah.
Hmm.
So I don't believe Strauss believed in that. However, he
Hmm.
did in fighting against tyranny and dictatorship. And
Hmm.
there's an interesting book, it's actually called On Tyranny, that is published by, I think, Agora Paperbacks, in which he has a debate on the subject of tyranny with Alexander Kodjev, who is a brilliant, professor of philosophy based in France. I think they were friends, if I'm not mistaken. And they
Hmm.
are discussing this very short dialogue, only about 20 pages, called Hero by Xenophon, who was a military general.
Hmm.
Sometimes tyrannicus is used to render the title. And they are talking about the meaning of tyranny here. See, so
Hmm.
Strauss's opposition to tyranny is very strong, and he does believe that we should, oppose it, and because it is basically, well, evil, wrong. And by the way, Joseph Stalin apparently used to keep a copy of the Prince under his pillow. I'm not sure whether that is true or not. His manual, you see, so to speak. So I think there's some of the reasons why Strauss was, people didn't like, that they felt threatened, I think, by his arguments that there is an objective difference between right and wrong, and that, in fact, the whole system of ethics and government can be structured on the basis of those basic principles, on the basis of the awareness of the difference between right and wrong, or good and evil. Now, by contrast, Nietzsche wants us to go beyond good and evil. And I
Yes.
think this was a major, major disaster in Western philosophy that he tried to do this, because I know that some of the professors, and some of them are Jews. Actually, Strauss himself was a Jew,
Of
perhaps not
course.
an Orthodox Jew, but
Mm.
uh, they don't hold it against him that he, perhaps they are being too soft on him. But I think that Nietzsche's thinking, going past the difference between good and evil, and also this idea of overman and the underman. Yeah, the Nazis
Hmm.
really loved Nietzsche. They used to visit his house, or like a shrine, because
Yes.
they liked the idea. They thought of themselves as the overman, right? And the others, they were the underman.
Yes.
History proved otherwise. The tables were turned on them by Allah, and they became the Untermensch, and the people that
Hmm.
they used to think of as the undermen, they became the overmen. Yeah, the Soviets defeated them in World War II. So what I'm trying to say is that this thinking that we should move beyond good and evil is very, very dangerous. And I think it, and also this idea of the difference between overmen and undermen, I think these two ideas actually paved the way for the two world wars, and they caused incalculable damage to the Western civilization. And by the way, I remember I popped into a bookstore one time, and I opened Nietzsche's Will to Power, and I opened it on a page where he's talking about fasting. As you know, fasting is recommended or required in Islam, and
Hmm.
what he says about it is just unbelievable. He refers to fasting as a sickness, that is something really horrible habit. I mean,
Hmm.
I have never read any passage which revealed a more shallow understanding of a concept like fasting than I did in that particular, on that particular page. So what I'm trying to say is that Nietzsche's writing, I think, is vastly overrated.
Yes.
He can be very, very shallow and superficial. And I just gave one example. His comments on fasting
Hmm.
is one. And his idea that we should somehow go past the difference between good and evil is downright catastrophic. I believe personally he lost his mind, and he did,
He
right?
did.
When
He did.
for 10 years he was a gone case. Yeah,
Yes.
and this is well
I
documented.
think this mental deterioration, which is manifest in his writings, is something that took place over several years, and it's bits and pieces. It's a dementia that slowly occurs. It doesn't just happen quick. It's something that is progressive, and it takes time, and there are mm, cavities, you see, lacuna in the thought process. And if you read carefully, you'll see these things. But it's very careful. It's very apparent from reading others who have criticized his work that certain influencers, certain political leaders extracted ideas from him, all right, and then misapplied them for their own purposes. And I think that what you're getting to here with respect to Mr. Strauss is that was something that was done also with respect to his work by his students and others who then were influenced by his students. I would like to pursue that because I want to see if we can't establish a parallel, you see, between Al Islam and Mr. Strauss and his definition of good and evil, which he says is inherent, you see, in our human experience. Well, if it's inherent, if it's there and it can be defined, how did he define it? And how was that received? And then how was it abused? Because if it was defined by him as a scientist, as a scientific thinker, you see, and I'm talking about metaphysical sciences now, then it was also defined in Al Quran, because what is good and true, what is true and evil, you see, is always true and evil. So we're talking about absolutism here, and that word is offensive to many in the postmodern era. They don't like to think in terms of what is absolute, because that gives them a the impression of tyranny. Well, tyranny has its place in the world. In the ancient world, when things got bad and push came to shove, we needed a tyrant. You see, you need a tyrant sometimes, just like you need a general to sort things out. That's what the sergeant of arms is at. When the judge says, arrest that man or restrain him, the judge is just speaking the words. The tyrant is actually doing the deed, you see. And so sometimes, the tyrant takes control of the moment and then he doesn't want to let go. See? So, but there is an absolute necessary need for such actions at times, and if someone's being assaulted and you just stand there and watch, and you don't take control of that moment and try to defend them to the best of your ability, you're going to be accused of non-tyranny. You see, if you accept my tenuous definition right now, because as the tyrant, you lend a hand and you stop that evil aspect of tyranny, because that person who's assaulting the other person is a tyrant. And so you've got to be the stronger tyrant. You've got to overpower him. And so this differentiation between the Übermensch and the Untermensch, if you will, is, well, which one's a tyrant, who's the non-tyrant, you see, who's the king, who's the subject, and who's, in Islamic terms, we want to determine, well, who's got the taqwa, who is the servant, who is the slave. I'm not sure that the word slave is really used, but servant is, who's serving the Most High. Who is that person? And how are they used by Allah, you see, in moments where that tyrant is needed? And then how is that tyrant retired until the next moment that they are needed, you see? Leo Strauss must have uncovered some of these principles and put them in certainly a better order than I'm just trying to narrate now or vocalize. So I would like to explore those in our next meeting, because I think this is a living memory. You see, we're talking about a living memory. We're talking about an academician who is well respected, and perhaps is also well misunderstood. You see, just like Alatas is Professor Alatas is well respected, but he's also well misunderstood, especially by many of the leaders whom he was. How say you, he was very influential at the time of getting these people into power and staying in power, and then they sidelined him over a period of years, you see, and all his marvelous ideas and how to establish the correct approach to an Islamic state, if you will, or an Islamic authority. All of these things were sort of cast aside. And so then you have this circle of evil. this circle of um, the the circle of ignorance, which prevents adab, so that people just think, oh, well, adab is just being polite. Well, no, 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 that's not what it is. What we're talking about is adab. Okay, so how did Mr. Strauss approach adab in this matter of good and evil? And then how was this his adab? How was that misapplied by his students? Because I think these principles are universal, they're absolute, they're part of divine law, if you will. All right, you do it this way, it's fine. If you don't do it that way, which is God's way, which is the divine order, then you're going to get this result. These are absolutes, and people don't want to admit that these absolutes exist, dear brother Karim. So I would like to explore this idea again next week, inshallah, if we can have the grace to meet again and continue the discussion, because I think it's crucial to understanding what happened in our living memory and also what happened to Al Islam 1,000 years ago. So, with that being said, dear brother, I will bid you farewell until next week.
Yes. Yes.
Wassalamu
Thank.
alaikum. Yes, yes, go ahead.
Sorry, no, I was just going to say, I don't
Mhm.
know whether I make this point. Yeah, just one final comment about Strauss. You know, he opens
Yes.
his natural writing history with an observation in relation to Spengler's work, which was entitled "The Decline of the West." And
Hmm.
Strauss' work is also set against the background of to this question. He calls it. He refers to the problem of the West as the crisis of the West. He claims the West is declining. It is in a crisis, and why?
Hmm.
Because genuine philosophical thought has declined or degenerated into what he calls ideology, all the isms, socialism,
Yes.
materialism, and also perhaps I could just add that to my earlier comments, is that he was basically struggling or trying to answer the same questions. Same question: is the West in decline, and if so, why? And the Strauss answers briefly the question by saying that the West is in crisis because it has become uncertain of its purpose. That is the short answer.
Now that's a wonderful idea.
Yeah,
That's really quite remarkable comment. It's uncertain of its purpose. Well, then that creates a constant state of anxiety, doesn't it? Of
yeah,
course it does. Well, thank you for reminding us of that and bringing that to mind, because that's a reality. That's
yeah,
living in fear, isn't it?
yeah.
Yes, fear of the unknown. So let's continue then next week, brother, if we can. Was-
Inshallah, inshallah.
Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.